Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's MarkMonitor webinar, Best Practices from Verizon, Proactively Mitigating Emerging Fraudulent Activities, where we'll be having a live discussion about how the largest wireless company in the U.S. proactively addresses the challenges brought on by fraudulent attacks. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today's fireside chat. We're joined by Patrick Flaherty, Assistant General Counsel from Verizon, and MarkMonitor brand protection expert Akino Chikada. Patrick is Head of Trademarks and Copyrights for Verizon's Marketing, IP, and New Media Law and Policy Group. He advises Verizon's worldwide business units on IP and new media law and policy issues, and manages and protects Verizon's IP rights. Patrick received a Bachelor of Corporate Law and an LLB from the National University of Ireland, Galway, and an LLM in IP Law from the George Washington University Law School. He is admitted to practice in the state of New York, is registered as a corporate counsel in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and is a solicitor in England and Wales. Akino is a Senior Product Marketing Manager for the MarkMonitor Brand Protection Solutions. She started her career in public relations and marketing in London and has worked in Europe, Asia, and the United States. She has led and served interim roles in global marketing strategies, product marketing, events management, public relations, corporate communications, and regional marketing. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Akino to get us started.
Thank you, Gina. And thank you, Patrick. We are so excited to have you join us today. And so as Gina mentioned, we'll be taking a Q&A format, and I'll be asking questions to Patrick where we'll focus on the different types of phishing infringements, get some real-life examples from Verizon, learn more about the business impact, and see what types of actions Verizon has taken to combat these fraud activities. And last but not least, we'll talk about recommendations and best practices. I have to say I'm really excited to talk about this topic, also because many people often associate phishing and fraud as a problem predominantly for financial industries, but that's definitely no longer the case. In fact, looking at our MarkMonitor data, since 2014, we've noticed a 400% spike in phishing attacks that's targeting non-financial industries. So essentially, any industry and companies that have a username and password associated really becomes a key target for phishing scams. So as we all know, Verizon is the largest wireless company in the U.S. with more than 110 million customers across the country. So protecting customers from fraudulent activity is top of mind, especially from a security and brand protection standpoint. So with that said, Patrick, can you please describe Verizon's fraud and phishing problems?
Sure, Akino. Thanks for having me. We've always had some form of phishing problem through the ages, so to speak. Historically, email, which everybody is more or less familiar with. But what we noticed in 2013, towards the end of 2013, was a large call volume from customers into our call centers, inquiring about text messages that they were receiving, asking customers to go to websites and either claim a prize or a reward or some type of promotion, or ask them about a security question. And these questions, in their large numbers, started to percolate up from the call centers through the business until eventually they came to the legal department. And it was at that point where, having investigated what was going on and seeing the nature of the fraud, that we realized that there was a big problem here related to phishing. And it was coming in, for the most part, in the form of either robocalls or smishing in the form of text messages over SMS, our text messaging service. The robocalls, in most instances, would leave a voicemail with the customer that they needed to go somewhere online, usually to a fraudulent domain name associated with a fraudulent website, again, to either claim some type of prize or reward or a promotion or answer a security question, all aimed at either collecting usernames, passwords, or other types of account information, or personal information, probably to be used for some type of identity theft. So going on to show just a couple of those examples, here's an example of just traditional phishing email. And we're all very familiar with this, where you receive an email into your inbox, you think it's coming from your service provider, asking you to do something, in most instances asking you to click on a link to go somewhere to enter some type of information.
Interesting. Thanks, Patrick. So you mentioned also robocalls and smishing. Do you have examples on this that you could share with us?
Yes. So focusing in on some of the texting examples that we saw related to smishing. In these instances, what they're asking for a customer to do is you see a request come in on your smartphone. You're either asked to click on a link. The first example talks about claiming a prize related to $50. The other link asks you to go to an account to verify your account information. And then the third example here is an actual screenshot where instead of asking you to go somewhere, they ask you to verify your information right there and then over the phone, getting down into the most personal type of information, asking for date of birth, your mother's maiden name, social security number, credit card information that just a normal provider just would never ask from a customer in this type of setting.
Interesting. So do you have like an actual example of a recent campaign that you could share with us today?
Yes. So all of these different types of phishing examples, again, were primarily focused on bringing the customer to a website that's made to look like a Verizon website. And they're very sophisticated in nature. A lot of times they're made to look like a legitimate Verizon website. Other times we've seen examples where they're not so pretty. They're very generic in nature, and they simply just include boxes asking for people to insert information, hoping to trick people to do that. Sometimes if you're careful looking at these types of websites, you'll see that they often contain signs where you can click through to go to view, for example, either terms of service or other type of hyperlinked information. But if you were to click on any of those links, you'd soon see that they're broken. Other examples would include copied logos or imagery that we have either created ourselves and use on our own websites, or that we've licensed from certain content providers or from phone manufacturers, or other seals that would give people an indication that maybe this site is a legitimate site coming from your service provider. In nearly all these instances, we see the use associated with some type of infringing domain name. And so the brand is either used directly in a standalone domain name or in the subdomain. So we've seen different variations in terms of naming conventions used by phishers in the form of, for example, Verizon-gifts.com, Activate, Verizon.com, Verizon-activate.com, other naming conventions around some of our other websites like VerizonWireless1.com, or where they'll try and make the URL appear legitimate in connection with the overall scam. So they might be offering a credit, like, for example, $54, and directing customers to a website that's either Verizon54.com or 54Verizon.com. This is an example of an older site from 2014 where when the customer clicks through to a link, they're brought to a landing page, to a website that's made to look like a Verizon website. And on it, they're asked for specific information, including your user ID or your mobile phone number, for example, your password, your billing zip code, and then the last 4 digits of your social security number, hoping to trick somebody to enter that information so that they can gather that information to then gain access to your account. This is an example of how a phishing text can start and how it progresses from one screen to the next. So in this example, what we see is there's a request that's come in asking a customer to enter a user ID or their mobile phone number. And in particular, what's at issue here, or what they're trying to present as a concern, is the security around the account. And what it is a customer could or should be doing in order to maybe better secure that account. So having entered in your mobile phone number or your user ID, you're brought to another page where you're asked to create a security question. So the trick here is to try and convince the subscriber that they need to do something more to better secure their account. So I guess the aim here is to make them feel good about themselves that, okay, I'm going to be proactive and I'm going to do something in order to prevent fraud from happening. So you're asked to select a security question and then to pick an answer associated with that. And so having done that, then it takes you to this next page where it's still questions as to whether or not, well, we're not sure this is really you. Thank you for the security question and your answer. We just need a little bit more information here in order to get you through this process. And here you see they ask for more detailed information, like, for example, the name on your credit card, the mailing address, your date of birth, your social security number, the actual card number, and other specific information related to that, with the idea then that they follow this up asking you to enter again your answer to your selected security question. So thinking then that you've gotten through this whole process and actually secured your account when in actual fact you've just given away most of your valuable personal information.
Yeah, so Patrick, just looking at these examples, the one thing that really strikes me interesting is how realistic and authentic this all looks. They really captured, these fraudsters have really captured your design, look, and feel. How would you say this impacts the number of victims that fall for this, and how do you see this impacting, I guess that's my question. How do you see this, the mimicking of the brand impacting the effectiveness of the fraudulent campaign?
Sometimes the copying can be really sophisticated and very close in nature to the actual overall branding that we're using on a day-to-day basis. In other instances, we see very, very basic and not so pretty versions of the website. It all depends on the nature of the fraudster and how much effort they put into the campaign that they're trying to push out and use across either one domain name, for example, or multiple domain names. So we've found ourselves in situations where, having identified a fraud in one spot, and if we were lucky enough to get it shut down, we would see it pop up again somewhere else with the exact same look and feel and the exact same kind of tactic in terms of the information that they're looking for, either account information related to the subscriber's account, or personal information to use probably for some type of identity theft later on somewhere else. An example of the branding and how close it can look to in terms of our site, you see this is a perfect example of a recent one involving VerizonWireless1.com. Again, a domain name that we don't own, but that's being used in connection with this overall phishing attack. You see that the imagery that they copy here is very close in nature or similar to what we would use even on our standalone websites related to the wireless business. They copy imagery like, for example, the photo here of the iPad that is an image that we have under license from Apple and that Apple licensed to other service providers that sell their products. It has a number of links. It has similar tabs in terms of the types of tabs and links that we use. In most instances, if a subscriber is careful enough to look around the site and to click on a lot of these tabs or these links, you'll see that they just don't work. Or the seals at the end of the page, like the trustee seal, they're just broken. They're just placed there, but they actually don't go anywhere. Another example is we see them copying us time and time again. So as the nature of our branding changes, so does the nature of the fraudsters copying. So looking at some older examples from 2013 into 2014, we see they're copying here the look and feel of our Verizon Wireless site with our Verizon Wireless logo. We see them copying again when we changed from a Verizon Wireless logo to what we call here our Verizon tab design.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, Patrick, I was just going to ask you because, you're talking about copying branding and all that, and from what I understand, in the last year, Verizon has actually rebranded and did some rebranding. So my question to you is, how does this impact fraudsters' campaign strategies? How quickly are they able to update and mirror and capture that same look and feel? Has it deterred any fraudsters from happening?
Unfortunately, it doesn't, and of course, it's not easy for any brand owner to go through a rebranding time and time again. There's a whole lot of effort that goes into that, and even changing the look and feel of a website isn't something that happens overnight. But we are amazed in terms of just how quickly it is that they will try and copy branding and use that in connection with the next best phishing attack. And we did see that happen rather quickly when we did do a major corporate rebranding last year and created a new Verizon logo. Soon thereafter that, we saw lots of examples involving either text messages or, again, fraudulent websites that used the new Verizon logo and, again, started copying the overall look and feel associated with that website and the use of the new logo on that website. So I have one example here on this next page, which, again, is a recent example involving, again, an infringing domain name where the brand is used in connection with the standalone. So here's an example of one for Verizon-Activate.com. Again, very similar in nature to one we saw on the previous example for VerizonWireless1.com. So in a lot of instances, we see that it's the same fraudster. They're engaged in the same type of phishing attack campaign. And if we're lucky enough to get one website shut down, they move on to another one. Or what we sometimes see happen is that we see a lot of domain names being registered with different types of names associated with them, all being used for the same type of phishing attack. So sometimes there's a commonality or a similarity between all of the naming that they use, sometimes not so much. But when you actually get to the website that's being used in connection with each of these domain names, you see that it's very similar in nature.
Yeah, that's a very interesting lesson. It's interesting because oftentimes as an end user, we don't double check the URL. And, to your point, fraudsters tend to use social engineering tactics where people get excited over like a new product, or like you said, if there was like a $54 campaign that's happening from Verizon, people get emotionally triggered by that, excited by it, they click away, and then they don't double check the URL or double check the legitimacy, and they fall for those phishing campaigns and scams, unfortunately.
Yeah, so sometimes they entice you with the carrot, and then in other instances they try and scare you. And so they present certain scams related to what we call security concerns. And so they try and make a big deal out of something when there isn't a security issue, but they try and make it look like it's something urgent, that it's important. And as a result of that, they hope that people then won't necessarily be as careful in terms of their maybe normal day-to-day checking. So somebody who wouldn't necessarily be easily fooled into claiming a $50 credit or some type of $50 promotion or prize might be more easily tricked if you present them with a scenario involving, well, there's a security issue involving your account, or we need to just verify your account. And so these types of phishing scams, there's always a certain angle to them. And where one person might not be necessarily fooled by one aspect of it, they could be fooled by another. So you can never be careful enough, unfortunately. And even when a standalone domain name is used in a lot of these instances, most people just don't know how to go and look up a domain name to see who owns it, even though it's very easy to do using a simple whois lookup.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. So shifting gears a little, especially now that we've seen all these phishing examples, can you tell us a little bit about how this all impacts your company, Verizon? And more specifically, can you share how exactly Verizon's being harmed by all these activities?
Sure. So to kind of better explain what is it that was going on in 2013, so the types of reports that we were getting as complaints from customers were that they were receiving bills for services that they just didn't order, or they were receiving bills for equipment that, again, they didn't order or buy. So an example, in instances where customers did hand over account information, be it username and password, and in doing so allow then for the fraudster to enter that account, what we saw happening was that additional services were added to the account, like additional lines, and in most instances, international calling lines. So international calling is really expensive if you don't have international calling associated with your account, and if you haven't picked a plan that you feel that you can afford. So what we saw happening was that accounts were changed to add international calling. A bill would be generated from that line that would go back to the main account holder, and when they would see what exactly it was the charge was for, they were calling in questioning the international calling charge, saying that they hadn't added it to the account. But it had been added to the account, and it looked like it had been added by the actual account holder. So upon further investigation, and as we started to learn more about what these phishing attacks were all about, this is what we saw was one of the big attractions for the fraudsters. And they would jump from one account to the next, where when they see that they could get it added, they would try and run up a bill as quickly as possible, and then where they saw it got shut down, then move on to the next account if they could gather account information in order to make those types of changes. Fraud losses also came into play related to equipment being ordered and then sent out to a different address, but the actual costs for that equipment being billed to the account holder. And again, a bill would come, the account holder would see that there was a charge for certain types of equipment. They would call in questioning the order, saying that they hadn't placed it. And true, they might not have placed it themselves, but it was legitimately placed, so to speak, under the account because somebody had accessed the account using a user ID or a phone number and a password that the subscriber had given up as a result of some type of phishing fraud. But outside of that, just the day-to-day costs associated with dealing with those types of complaints, the call center costs, the business costs associated with just investigating those types of complaints, checking accounts where we saw then and confirmed that there were unauthorized access and changes made to those accounts, then you have to go through a process of resetting the whole account, making sure that what's there is legitimately there, and there's a whole time and effort that goes into that that takes a lot of time. So those are costs that we experience on the business end, and then in terms of the actual costs associated with what the legal department does in terms of helping to investigate and trying to run down the fraud and identify the fraud and confirm the fraud, and then working with our security organization at the same time. So there's a lot of people running around the company and talking about these issues and working on them and trying to fix them. And all of those costs and expenses soon start to add up.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point to highlight because often we just look at the immediate costs. So as you mentioned, the international calling costs or the fraud loss costs through the ordered equipment. But really, the impact it has goes far and beyond and really adds up when you start thinking about customer services, the fraud remediation costs. But beyond that, also like the impact it has to your brand reputation, right? That probably has an impact as well.
Yes, because you can imagine a lot of people inquire as to, well, why is it that the fraud happened and how could you have let it happen? What are you doing about the fraud? All of those types of questions that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis where in instances, even when we know about the fraud, working on trying to get it shut down is just not always as easy as you would think.
Yeah. So I guess this really does beg the question that you have outlined. What do these bad guys want? And do you have an example that will more specifically outline the cost of fraud and walk us through an example of it?
Sure. So on the services side, obviously, like I explained, international calling can be really expensive. And so that's a cost that varies depending on how many calls are obviously placed and then billed to the subscriber account. But thinking about equipment and just the high costs that can be generated associated with equipment going out the door that is then billed to a customer, and the customer doesn't want to pay for it because they say they didn't get it. And so you're in a situation then where you have to credit back an account, and you're also out of pocket because the equipment has gone out the door. So, of course, what all these bad guys want are the most expensive and most luxurious and most sought-after types of electronics. So you're looking at iPhones and iPads and Samsung Galaxy products. And when you think about the high cost associated with these devices, it can soon start to add up, and especially when you're looking at just the size of our consumer base with over 110 million access lines. If everybody were to be affected by fraud in some way, shape, or form, and even if there's only an incremental charge associated with all of those accounts, the money can really start to add up really quickly. So thinking about these devices and just how expensive they can be, not everybody knows the true cost of an iPhone, because for a lot of subscribers it's subsidized in some way, shape, or form, or they're paying it as part of they're paying for it over time as part of an installment plan. But you can spend as much as $850 on an iPhone. You can spend as much as $730 on an iPad mini, for example. So, there are real hard costs there that can be readily identified when you start to add up the fraud losses for equipment that goes out the door, and then all of a sudden nobody wants to pay you for it.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see and imagine how quickly things add up, truly. So, what does Verizon do to help, customers from falling victims to these scams? And what steps do you specifically take to help your customers?
So obviously, telling customers about the problem is really important, and having some type of fraud prevention is also just as important. What we've tried to do is create an educational program and to educate consumers about this issue, that there are sometimes robocalls or what we call suspicious phone calls, the smishing, the text messages, or the emails asking customers to go somewhere and hand over either account information or personal information. So our main focus is on telling customers just not to reply to these types of requests, and that they only go to their legitimate websites if they want to do something in connection with their Verizon account. So either they're My Verizon on Verizon.com or on VerizonWireless.com. And if you're on a site that you think maybe is just not what you think is a legitimate Verizon site, then not to provide over any type of information. We have tried to create as many ways for customers to contact us if they see any type of either actual or potential fraud. So we've created some email addresses for use internally and externally for phishing at Verizon.com or phishing at VerizonWireless.com. We have a whole bunch of people associated with those email addresses, so when something does come in, it's routed around the company, as well as to MarkMonitor to help us in trying to verify as to whether or not something that is being reported is potential or actual fraud. And then it goes through a process of further confirmation and verification, and then there's an action plan in terms of how to tackle it. We tell customers that they can always text something that comes across on their phones to us by using spam or the short code 7726, or they can always call us, either using our 800 number or just by simply dialing star 611 from their mobile phone.
Yeah, education is definitely key, and at MarkMonitor we definitely highlight the value of getting your customers to be part of your allies and have them be part of your strategy to combat fraud overall. So I think that's really great. So can I ask, a lot of the times IT security is associated with also fraud prevention, and I'm curious to know, in your role as, part of the legal department, what steps do you take to mitigate, and how do you contribute?
So legal plays a big role in terms of helping the security organization, because in a lot of instances we see that the fraud is always being used in connection with the brand. So because of that, we work well with security, the IP department that is, because we monitor the brand on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of the things that we're monitoring for are also catching this. But in terms of just our overall role on a day-to-day basis, when we do see instances of actual or possible phishing or fraud, we do our own investigating, or we get help from security, or we work together in investigating a complaint. In instances where we think that we'll actually get some traction on a letter, we'll send a letter. But unfortunately, sending a cease and desist letter is no magic bullet. Some people respond to them, other people don't. And in all of the fraudulent examples that we've encountered since 2013, for example, sending a letter to the registrant, the actual person who registered the domain name, no one has ever responded. But we have had some success in terms of writing to registrars and ISPs expressing our concerns around the nature of the use, where it's clear that there's some type of fraudulent activity going on. And so we have seen some good cooperation from that standpoint. Obviously, there are other options available to us, like a UDRP, when we see a standalone domain name being used in connection with some type of fraud. But the problem with the UDRP is that you have to take into consideration just the amount of time that would go into it being processed. Not even the amount of time that would go into filing the complaint. You could probably get a complaint drafted in a decent format so that you could use it almost as a template going forward for these types of fraud. But unfortunately, even if you're able to get that down so you could turn around and complain within a couple of hours or within a day or so, getting it on file with WIPO or the NAF, you're still looking at anywhere between 10 to 12 weeks to get a decision. So the timing there just doesn't necessarily always match up with the end goal result in terms of getting the fraud shut down sooner rather than later. It might be important to file one for the sake of getting a domain name back if it's something that you think is of interest and is something that maybe you want to use going forward. But again, it's not always going to be practical in situations where maybe you just don't want the domain name. And so you're going to spend a lot of money chasing it down, filing a UDRP to get it, to hold on to it in your portfolio and do nothing with it. And it's also not possible because we've had people ask, well, why is it we just can't register all of these domain names? It's just not possible because of the naming convention that they use or the different options that are available to them in terms of making use in the subdomain. Even if we could possibly register everything as a standalone, we'd still see the fraud examples in the subdomain, and in most instances, that type of use is way more popular than standalone domain names. We have our own watch services, like I said, that we use just on a day-to-day basis to help us with monitoring the brand, and so in a lot of instances, they do generate good examples of where we see potential fraud, especially in the domain name space. So we've seen that happen recently where we've seen one particular fraudster registering different variations of a name, but all similar in nature. And so as we see them being registered now, we have a good idea that it's the same person getting ready to do the same type of fraud. So sometimes you see a pattern happening, and you can watch out for that in connection with a lot of these domain name watch services. But in other instances, we see domain names being registered, no use associated with them. So you might think to yourself, well, maybe it's not a problem, I'll move on to the next. But then the domain name actually does then get used like a week later or a couple of weeks later. So there's a monitoring aspect associated with this as well. But if you have a large cyber squatting problem, it's going to be really difficult to continue to monitor every domain name that's registered. And then lastly, obviously, legal action and trying to work with local law enforcement wherever possible. We have had some success with that, but they're busy as well, and so it eventually falls on you to do other things. You just can't rely on reporting to the local police or government agencies or FBI.
Right. No, of course, especially when you're combating fraud, having a scalable approach, and a scalable and effective approach is critical. But it's really clear to me that, Verizon and you are clearly taking a lot of proactive prevention steps to make sure that you're mitigating fraud as much as possible. And to that end, not to steal your thunder, Patrick, but I do know you do have amazing educational material for your customer base as well. I think we do have.
We have educational video training, and that was created by the security organization. And so one video in particular talks about just better account security and why it's so important, because at the end of the day, you just can't forget about the human element associated with that. So this video is about 3 minutes in total. It's on YouTube in case anybody wants to see it in its totality, but we're just going to play a minute of it here for people to take a look and listen in.
Online banking, online bill pay, online files, and photos. More of our important and potentially sensitive information is moving to the internet, and more internet bad guys are trying to get it. So internet security is more important than ever. That's why Verizon is updating our account authentication requirements to a more secure two-step login. Whether you're just starting out or being asked to update your existing account, here's how the new Verizon authentication requirements work. If you see this screen when logging into your My Verizon account, it means it's time to set your new security information. Just follow the on-screen instructions. First, you'll create a new password for better security. Our system will prevent you from using passwords that are too easy to guess. This box shows our password requirements, such as length, use of special characters, and complexity.
So the idea around the video is to educate around account security and better passwords. And you'll see it talks about a two-step process where there is a password created initially. It'll check to make sure that it's something that we feel meets our standards for better security, even though it might be frustrating in terms of trying to come up with a name to meet those different types of requirements. And then go on to ask you to create some type of security image. So this is not specific information to a Verizon subscriber per se. This is good information that consumers across the board, across different industries, whether you're a subscriber for another wireless carrier, to make sure that you have good login information so that fraudulent activity isn't going to affect you or isn't going to get into that space and do some damage.
I love that video, and yeah, to your point, it is applicable across the board in other industries, and it's just part of best practices. So I thank you for sharing that.
Because one of the other issues we face is that even though you might be able to secure this type of information, you can't forget the human element, like I said, and we're all guilty of using the same username and password across different platforms. Be it once or twice or more times. And what ends up happening is that if your banking information gets corrupted and you use that same information for your Verizon account or some other online account, fraudsters, they go around plugging in this information here and there and everywhere. And if they think that they can get into a phone account, they will and try and do some damage. So unfortunately, what that means for us is that it looks like it's the legitimate customer coming in because they're using their exact username and password. But if it's the fraudster because he got it from their financial institution or somewhere else, there's just no way of knowing. So there's that human element associated with it. So that's why the educational component to this is really important, because it helps to kind of secure and better protect the subscriber themselves, so they have a part to play here.
That's an incredibly important point to emphasize. And I think, fraudsters in general have always evolved their tactics and, their social engineering schemes. But phishing has remained one of those really effective tactics, unfortunately. But it does put the onus on us as the end user to be aware and always be mindful of the potential fraud that could be behind any of this. So it is really good practice for us. So segueing from then, can you tell us a little bit more about your other approaches for combating fraud?
Well, partnering with MarkMonitor has played a key role in terms of getting to the front of this problem. We have a lot of capabilities as an ISP. So, for example, when we see fraud, we can block things from internally within the company on our internal network. But there's very little that we can do externally to stop customers from continuing to see a fraud. And so in a situation like that, you have to work with somebody who can help you to protect by detecting and monitoring and responding to these types of attacks as they happen earlier on in their infancy, or even as their as a domain name is being created and a fish is beginning to take shape. So getting to the front of the problem is really important, and there's nothing that we can do by ourselves. It was important that we partner with somebody who's an expert in this field and who could help us identify all of those risks at the time they're just beginning to happen or even before they start.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate that plug in there. So tell us, can you share some results and what you've seen in terms of your Verizon fraud trends, I guess?
Sure. Well, the reporting has been really good that we've seen come in from the service, and we get a weekly report, and then we're looking at it again monthly, and then obviously then we're looking at it come the end of the year to see how things are trending. But to kind of give you an example without getting into the specifics about the numbers, what we have seen overall is that by partnering with an expert to kind of help us monitor and detect and address the fraud earlier on, we've seen a downward trend in the overall phishing attacks. So what does that mean? It means that the fraudsters see that we are proactive in this space and that we're very responsive. And as a result of that, then they seem to be moving off of us onto somebody else. We see higher levels of fraud earlier on in 2013, and then overall a trending downwards. So that makes us feel good. It doesn't mean that we can eliminate the fraud completely, which we would love, but I just don't think that's technically possible because of just the ongoing nature of it. But the trending of it continuing to trend downwards, we're really happy about that. And just to try and identify why we see different spikes occurring throughout this trending example, we see a lot of spikes occurring where we see fraudsters really gear up and try and attack us in a big way when we see iconic phone launches like every September when Apple pushes out a product. We see definite spikes in that space or during that time period. We also see a higher level of attack for back to school for things like Black Friday and around the Christmas time period.
Believe me, I'm excited to see a downward trend for you guys as well. And I think it is interesting how fraud, and especially for your industry and your company, like things, fraudulent attacks do trend upwards when, there is some campaign or there is some seasonal activity or there is an iconic launch happening. So it's
because they also prey on people's emotions during that time, like, for example, back to school and everybody's trying to save money, and so they're looking for bargains because every kid needs a new phone going back to school or a new computer, or at the same time around Christmas where everybody wants some new fancy electronic device. And so they do try in a big way to convince people that if you could save $50 here or $54 there, it's very enticing when people are being budget conscious and they're not necessarily maybe checking as carefully as we would like them to be.
Absolutely. All right, so I couldn't help but notice that we're getting a lot of questions from the audience as well, so I do want to have some time saved so that we could tackle those questions. But let me ask you my very final question for you, which is, overall, what's your recommendation for other companies, and any pearls of wisdom that you could share with us?
Sure. So a couple of things that I think are really important. And so these would be kind of my top 5 recommendations. So really important from the get-go is just being on the offensive and getting to the front of the problem as quickly as possible. No matter how good you are at being responsive to the problem, you're going to have better results in terms of cutting down the number of complaints and the number of fraud losses and overall expenses and business costs if you can deal with this issue at the time it just happens or even before it happens. And so partnering with somebody that can help you do that, that's an absolute. Monitoring 24/7, a vendor will definitely help you do that. You can also obviously do your own monitoring and get some help if you have your own security organization. We do our own monitoring because we have our brand protection, and that kind of ties in nicely with what we see happening in connection with some type of fraud, and where we think that something looks particularly fishy, we send it to the security organization for investigation, or we send it to MarkMonitor. Education just within the business is as important as educating customers and letting people know across the business that this is a problem, and that if you see it or you think that you see it, having a way for people to communicate and report those types of issues to you, both internally and externally, really important.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. All right, so now we're going to move to some questions from the audience. Can you tell us what happens to the standalone domain names?
In most instances, what we see happening is that they're dropped. So I don't know if people remember the problem we saw before a long time ago with domain name tasting, where cyber squatters would register a domain name, see if it gets any traffic, and if it didn't, then they would drop it. We kind of see the similar thing happening here involving fraudsters. We see the domain name registered for a while, used in connection with the fraud, and then dropped.
Okay. I know you kind of mentioned UDRP earlier, but is the UDRP or URS maybe ever an option?
Again, maybe an option if it's a domain name that's really of concern to you, or maybe it's one that you might want to use going forward for something else. I just think that the timing around both of those options, even though the URS is supposed to be quicker in nature and does help with the overall suspension of the domain name, that is helpful compared to the UDRP, where you're waiting until the very end to see whether or not the domain name is awarded, orders transferred to you, and then you're still stuck in an appeal day period before it actually will transfer. So there's a lot of downtime there where there can be a lot of damage caused by an ongoing fraud, unless you have other people in between who can kind of help you address that. So either you're working with a vendor that deals with anti-fraud, watch and takedown, or you're lucky enough to reach out to a registrar or an ISP who is willing to help you.
So one question, if a fraudulent address is used for ordered equipment, so this goes back to what an earlier conversation we had about ordered equipment, international costs, the kind of fraud that we've seen from Verizon. So the question is, if a fraudulent address is used for ordered equipment, why can't that address be validated unless the hack is only providing havoc as an objective?
Well, I guess maybe what that question means is that if there's a shipping address that's different from what's on the account, and nowadays that is verified. So if somebody orders equipment and it's not being sent to the address on record for the account subscriber, it doesn't get sent out unless it's verified.
Great. Another question. I received SMISH from short code numbers. How easy is it for those short code numbers to be obtained?
Oh, wow, I have no idea. That's beyond my expertise.
Good answer.
But I can hopefully maybe ask somebody who knows.
Yeah, we can certainly follow up on that. Another question for you. Is there a way you can stop phishing completely?
No, unfortunately not, because, well, it depends. When we talk about just fraud and fraud losses and fraud prevention, I don't think it's possible to stop it completely, only because even if, for example, fraudsters decided that they weren't going to attack Verizon in a concerted way as of today going forward, we would still have instances where, like I said earlier on, if a customer uses the same username and login across all of their different providers, be it their phone provider or where they do their online shopping or their online banking, whatever the case may be, and if some fraudster does get that information and they decide to shop it around and plug it in different places, including on Verizon.com or VerizonWireless.com, and if they get in because they have that information and they decide to do something bad, then we're never going to be able to guarantee 100% that some damage isn't going to be done there, because from the Verizon perspective, it looks like you're actually entering legitimately as you, even though it's not you. Even though you didn't necessarily give away that information in connection with some type of fraudulent text message or a website or email, it was taken away from you or you gave it away somewhere else. But because you're using the same username and login, it's shopped around from one online platform to another. And I guess a lot of people just aren't aware of that potential risk, but it's a real risk. So, like I said, even if the fraudsters left us alone and stopped trying to attack Verizon customers today or tomorrow going forward, we would still run into that issue, I'm sure of it.
Yeah.
Right. Well, great. Thank you, Patrick and Akino. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions, but thanks for joining us for today's Fireside Chat. I'd also like to thank everyone tuning in for your participation. We had some great questions come in, so thank you for those. Now, as a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days, so be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.